Rolling. This is the FedSoc Films Podcast,
where we continue the conversation
sparked on film.
White on set. You want to know what freedom tastes like? It tastes like this beer.
Take one.
This is, in fact, the classic solution in search of a problem.
Action.
That cannot help but be controversial.
Cut. With expert discussion and analysis. With the greatest legal minds on the topic today. The FedSoc Films Podcast. It's a wrap.
On February 29, 2020, Washington Governor Jay Inslee declared a state of emergency in response to the growing spread of COVID-19 and the first reported death from the virus in his state. His proclamation gave state agencies access to additional funds to brace for the onslaught of what would become an international pandemic. This might have been the first emergency declaration for COVID in the U.S., but it was far from the last. Before the end of 2020, every state in the country had declared an emergency. Hello, and welcome to the FedSoc Films Podcast. I'm Ann Hartley, your declarative host. We recently released a film about how Wisconsin dealt with the COVID pandemic. I have with me Kelly Deeere, who is a professor at Rutgers Law School, to discuss the use of emergency powers during COVID. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you, Ann, for having me.
It is absolutely a pleasure. So I know you wrote an extensive article comparing how different states, including Wisconsin, dealt with COVID. What spurred you to take a look at this topic?
Well, just like most of you, this was the first time a lot of us in our lifetimes experienced every single state in the United States declaring a state of emergency. And then the plethora of executive orders being issued by each of these governors, stay-at-home orders, restrictions on gatherings, and other things such as moratorium on evictions and, unemployment benefits that came around that. And I had always been in the public health field. I was part of the research team for HIV and AIDS back in the late 90s and early 2000s for gay men's health crisis. And so I'd always been in the public health realm. And this just spurred me to write about it. And as most of us, I was at home and had a little bit of extra time to kind of look into it. And that spawned a lot of my research and my scholarship.
Gotcha. So I'm curious how you went about researching this topic. It sounds like there was an awful lot going on this front. So where to start?
Well, yeah. So it really started with reading articles, such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journals, and then local articles. And it was really interesting to see how the executive orders evolved. And so that's kind of how it started. And then luckily, I was able to have some research help. I started actually pulling the executive orders, and all of this information is easily accessible on websites. You can see all the executive orders. And so I started understanding a little bit about why some of these governors were issuing executive orders. And most governors issued a plethora of executive orders, all of them, even some states in the beginning between February of 2020, when Washington State governor first issued his declaration of emergency, and the end of June, every state had issued a number of executive orders, some as few as 18, some as high in Michigan and Colorado in the low 100s. Wisconsin falls probably right in the middle, around 38. It wasn't unusual in the amount of orders that it declared. But I became fascinated just because it's been unprecedented that all 50 states would be declaring orders and similar types of orders. And so it became a really interesting piece to look and see how some states were handling it differently than others.
Gotcha. Now, from what you've said so far, it sounds like a lot of what was happening was very much at like the executive level with these executive orders. Do you mind going into a little more detail about what those are and why this was the particular way that states were dealing with COVID?
Yeah, so it really comes down to what the states do versus what the federal government does versus what the local government does. And so the 10th Amendment of our U.S. Constitution grants all remaining powers that aren't delegated specifically to the federal government to the state government. And one of the primary powers is the police power, which governs health and safety. And so anything concerning health and safety is really delegated to the states. So while the federal does have certain powers, a lot of it is the power of the purse. And you saw a lot of these with the agencies and getting money for vaccines and the like. But really a lot of the power to protect citizens during a pandemic, it came from the states. And so what pretty much every state has is what I will term very broadly as a state disaster statute for when we have certain kinds of disasters. Now, some states have a public health emergency statute and a state disaster statute. Some states have merged the two, and some states just have one where they issue a state of emergency for all kinds of disasters. And typically you would, before the COVID-19 pandemic, you would see this most often in hurricanes and tornadoes. 9/11 is an example, to where there was some kind of state of disaster and declare a state of an emergency. But it really derives from the 10th Amendment and the police power that the states have. Local governments do have some powers too, and some of that could be delegated either through the state's constitution or more than likely from state disaster statutes itself. So that's why really the states really took the lead, and specifically the governors during the pandemic.
Gotcha. So it really was up to the governors to act on this front.
Yes, presumably that if they were given the kinds of powers to act in the pandemic. And as we know, we have 50 states, we have 50 different statutes, and no two statutes look identical.
Gotcha. So I'm curious if you know any detail how the emergency statute in Wisconsin stacks up compared to other state statutes. Is it at all unusual, or is it pretty run of the mill?
I would say it's in between. So I wouldn't say it is a standout. So most state statutes have a durational limitation, meaning when the governor, or in some cases the state legislature, can declare a state of emergency, there is a time limit on it, meaning that the state of emergency will expire after so many days. And most states have a durational limitation, such as Wisconsin. And most states will have a durational limitation of 30 or 60 days. So Wisconsin has a 60-day durational limitation, which is not unusual. What is a little bit different from Wisconsin from the majority of states is who has the right to renew a state of emergency. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, Wisconsin was only one of about 6 states where the governor could not renew the state of emergency, only the state legislature. Post-pandemic, entering 2023, that number has increased to 11. But 11 out of 50 states. And that made it unusual in the sense that a lot of governors were able to renew the state of emergency as well.
Oh, that is fascinating. So you actually saw a trend moving towards what Wisconsin had with this limitation on declaring a state of emergency?
So I would say I saw an overall trend on limiting executive powers to some extent. And some state legislation amended it to only allow the state legislature to renew it. Some states added a durational limitation. Some states added what gives the state legislature a right to terminate a declaration of emergency by concurrent resolution. The majority of states had already had that provision, including Wisconsin, but a few states added that. So I did see a few states add that, but I would mark that a couple of them added that, but they also allowed the governor to renew as well. Arizona and Rhode Island come into mind, and they were really interesting in the sense I look at it as kind of a hybrid, in the sense that they increased the durational limitation to, I believe Arizona was 120 days and Rhode Island was 180 days, gave the governor longer period of time, but then only allowed the state legislature to terminate, to renew the declaration of emergency.
Gotcha. So it sounds like there were a lot of variations on the same theme, kind of based on what was happening in the individual states.
Yeah, I think COVID, because of the length of it, gave a good length of time for the legislatures and the government to step back and say, okay, how do we do this going forward? Because obviously these disaster statutes were not created with COVID-19 in mind. A lot of these state disaster statutes were initially passed after World War II. A lot of them some of them were passed in the 70s, and a lot of them were amended right after 9/11. And it wasn't because of 9/11 itself, it was from anthrax. And a lot of them had modified the public health emergency statutes to kind of think about that kind of threat, the kind of threat where you you want to isolate and quarantine individuals. And it really didn't contemplate a virus such as COVID that was spread differently. So I think it really gave an opportunity to kind of step back and look. And, we have kind of a mixed bag as a result.
Gotcha. So did you see a lot of copycatting in the different states, both in terms of the long-term response to COVID and these emergency statutes and in terms of the executive orders?
Copycatting meaning I think everybody, once you started the stay-at-home orders, a lot of other governors said, yes, that's a good idea. Obviously, they had scientists and the public health, their state health department weighing in on that. And so I don't know if it was so much as a copycat, but more like that was a good idea. I don't know specifically about trends in amending the legislation, if that's what you're asking for. I didn't see a lot of copying that way. Again, a lot of these statutes are structured very differently. I did see, to some extent, some limitations on power. What I did see a lot of was, I would say the biggest addition I saw was adding some kind of provision that said places of worship was an essential service. So there was a flurry of litigation you may be familiar with, where there was a number of actions that were brought when there were gathering restrictions that included places of worship. And the Supreme Court came down in a series of cases that basically said that we need to treat places of worship as we treat any other secular organization. And I think out of that, a number of states took away from that and added a provision in their state disaster statute, or separately to include places of worship as an essential service. So that might have been one of the biggest changes that I saw over the course of the pandemic in amending the state disaster statute.
Oh, that is interesting. That means that Wisconsin definitely wasn't the only state dealing with litigation out of these emergency declarations.
Oh, absolutely not. And I would actually, Michigan was really the first one that kind of came in. And, when I said there was only a handful of states that didn't allow the governor to renew a state of emergency, Michigan was one of those states as well. And they were actually the first state in the United States to no longer have a state of emergency. Because, like Wisconsin, the Michigan governor did not have the authority to renew a state of emergency. And so, yes, there was a flurry of litigation. I would say there was a fair bit of litigation in Michigan, Wisconsin, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. And I would say typically that litigation happens when there was a governor that was of a different political party than the state legislature. It really was litigation between those two branches of government. And there tended to be less litigation in those states where the political parties were aligned.
Gotcha. So in your opinion, would you say it was a matter of partisanship there, or different political philosophies, or just practical issues?
I think there was a combination of all. I certainly, I think there was certainly a political alignment. A lot of what kind of came out of it was why the emergency was continuing and what kind of orders were weighing down political constituents of a lot of these parties, such as the mask mandates and the stay-at-home orders and the gathering restrictions. And so I think that kind of weighed on a lot of the legislature's minds when they were considering it.
Gotcha. So I'd like to just take a step back here. And I know we talked about this at the beginning, how it was not the federal government, but the states that were responsible for acting here in response to COVID by and
Absolutely.
large. Do you think that was a good thing? Do you think that was ultimately helpful? Did it work out well?
Well, yes and no. And so we have a very large geographic country. We have large urban centers. We have people in rural areas and city areas. And I do think to some extent to have one rule can be problematic. At the same time, we are a very mobile society, and that was difficult as well. I do think it could be a little unwieldy to have one order. And so I think keeping it at the state level where it's more responsive to the individual constituents is I think overall the best policy. I would say that I would like to see more local government involved because again, really that is where the heart of the matter is. And I have written another piece in the North Carolina Law Review about local government and the powers that they should have during an emergency. And one of my arguments is that local government should have more powers because they are really at the forefront and they are the most responsive to their constituents. I mean, obviously, when you think about Wisconsin, the needs of the constituents in Milwaukee are very different than the constituents further, in a more rural area. And for local government to be more responsive there, I think just would be more important. And again, as we saw in the pandemic, the virus played differently at different times. I mean, Wisconsin had its own set of surges, particularly in the fall of 2020, and it was a little quieter over the summer in 2020, whereas other places like Florida, I believe, surged then. So, to have one set of rules and not have government as close to the constituents, I think overall would be a problem.
Sure, I definitely see what you're saying there. So I'm curious what your biggest takeaway was from studying how the different states handled COVID.
My biggest takeaway is that I'm a big fan of checks and balances, but the right kind. And I think my biggest takeaway is that there is a time and place for the governor to have powers to act in emergency. And when I began looking at these statutes more post-pandemic to see kind of like what did we learn, how has state government responded to this, I really kind of liked what Arizona and Rhode Island has done to some extent. Like, let's give the governor some power to act in an emergency because they are the ones that can act nimbly and quickly in an emergency. As legislature is slow. I mean, they can't act or they may not act at all. I mean, Wisconsin has a full-time legislature. Michigan had one too, but the majority of states don't. And some states are on biannual session, meaning they don't go every year. And so to have a legislature be really responsive in a lot of ways is highly problematic. And the Kentucky Supreme Court actually said this in some of its decisions on the governor's powers. And so there really needs to be that kind of balance. But at some point, you want the state legislature to be able to come in and do more. And so I think, thinking about it is like, yes, I do like the checks and balances in there, but I do want the governor to have some initial powers to be able to protect the citizens. So that's really what these state disasters are setting up. I'm thinking about Hawaii and all this and the recent fires and the devastation on Maui. And I'm thinking that I believe Hawaii has a 60-day durational limitation. It's going to be more than that. And there is, I have to check, but I don't think there is a specific provision as to who renews the declaration. So presumably when it's silent, the governor can renew it. But then again, that's a situation that's not even a public health emergency where you can see that it's just not going to stop after 60 days.
Do you think that states are left in the wake of COVID better equipped to deal with emergencies?
Statutorily, maybe not. I think maybe we've learned some lessons on what to do. I think we're a little bit more careful, or hopefully the governors will be a little bit more careful how they craft executive orders so that they can actually prepare and protect its citizens at the same time balancing constitutional rights. So in that sense, I think we're better prepared because we have knowledge of how the courts kind of look at protecting, health and public safety versus protecting people's constitutional rights. Overall, we've pulled back some of these powers. And so there is less, I think, that a lot of governors and state health agencies can do in a pandemic. There's about half the states have vaccine mandate bans. And so I'm not even thinking about COVID if there's another virus that comes around. Some of these statutes even apply to a future virus, which could be problematic. It takes a tool out of their toolbox. It'd be one thing to say, hey, we've looked at the situation over a year, and we don't think it's a good idea to mandate something. And so we want to ban on that. It's another thing to do something in the future where you do not have an idea of what's going to happen. And that's, I think, one of the more problematic situations that came out of the pandemic was just the fear of requiring people to do anything without the knowledge. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it sounds like there were definitely some good effects, but maybe some that were less good.
Absolutely.
So one last question before I let you go. Where can our listeners find out more about you and your work?
Most of my work is published, and I'll have links on my website at Rutgers University. Kelly Deeere, Associate Clinical Professor of Law. I will have a new article coming out that basically is talking a lot of what we talked about. It's called Doing More with Less. It talks about how a lot of state legislatures have pulled back on the pandemic and how we can look at the state disaster statutes and be more thoughtful, more intentional, and protect not only citizens in a public health situation, but balance that with constitutional rights.
Well, I will certainly look forward to reading that.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Kelly, for joining us today, and thank you folks for listening in. You can find our film, Pandemic Powers, Wisconsin's State of Emergency, on our YouTube channel or at fedsoc.org. That's FEDSOC.org. As always, the Federalist Society takes no position on particular legal or public policy issues. All expressions of opinion are those of the speaker. That's a wrap.
This has been a FedSoc audio production.